The Rebbe starts off the Sicha by saying that in regards to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, there are generally two commands. Number one, lilmoid. Number one, to learn by oneself. The chiyuv, when a person is able to, has the understanding to learn Torah. And number two, the obligation to teach Torah to other people. Specifically, this obligation is on a father to teach his son's Torah. Says the Rebbe, we find something very, very surprising regarding this. Both the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe start Hilchos Talmud Torah not with the halacha that you're obligated to learn Torah by yourself, but rather with the halacha that there is an obligation in mitzvah saseh min Torah for a father to teach, to learn Torah with his young son. Seemingly, it's not understood. First of all, we should be speaking about the obligation of learning Torah generally. That means learning Torah by oneself. And only afterwards to tell us that it's not only enough to learn by yourself, but there's also an obligation to teach others, to teach your son. And simply the Rebbe says, the obligation to teach Torah to your son is only because there is an obligation to learn Torah. Says the Rebbe, and this is actually extra tzivui in regards to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, different, and in addition to other mitzvahs in the Torah where we don't find the idea of chinuch, of educating a young child, other than midrabanan. But midoraisa, we only find this idea in regards to teaching children Torah. Especially, says the Rebbe, you can't even teach somebody else Torah without first learning yourself Torah. And furthermore, as the Gemara says, divrei Torah, not only you have to know the words of Torah, but it should be sharp, fluent by you, etc. So in other words, clearly you need to learn Torah first before you teach somebody else Torah. So the Rebbe says, simply we could explain that this would be for two reasons. Number one, says the Rebbe, since there's an obligation, mitzvah saseh min Torah, to learn Torah with a child. Again, not like by other mitzvahs where min Torah there is no chiyuv to educate children. Says the Rebbe, therefore it follows that the learning Torah by each and every individual starts when? Min Torah starts when he's a child. And therefore, Hilchos Talmud Torah starts with the halachos of Limud Torah as they are in every person's life, where it starts first as a little child. So that's one thing the Rebbe says we could possibly say. Another thing, says the Rebbe, we know that the mitzvah for learning Torah says many, many times in the Torah, both the mitzvah of learning as well as the mitzvah of teaching. But the main place, the one that's counted when the Rambam is counted as a mitzvah, where do we know the idea of learning Torah? Comes from the pasuk of Voeschanan livonecha. This is in fact the pasuk of this parashas Voeschanan, which includes, as the Rambam says, to learn Torah, but also to teach Torah. V'shinantam, to teach it to your children. And since the main source for the obligation of lilmod Torah, even for learning Torah, is from this pasuk v'shinantam livonecha, which simply would be referring to teaching it to your child, to your little child, says the Rebbe, this could be the reason why Hilchos Talmud Torah starts off with the obligation of the father learning Torah with his little child. However, says the Rebbe, this itself would need explanation. Why is mitzvahs Talmud Torah unique and different from other mitzvahs, with number one, that Limud Torah has a connection, min Torah, also to a child, again, different to other mitzvahs, and that furthermore, number two, the obligation of learning Torah, even your obligation of learning yourself Torah, is included in which words? V'shinantam livonecha, it's about teaching your children Torah. Says the Rebbe, seemingly we would be able to say, at least b'doichik, that the reason is to bring out the difference between the way we learn Torah nowadays to the way we're going to be learning Torah la'asid lavi. The Rebbe says it's obvious that when Yidden are going to be free to be learning Torah and its chachma in the time of Mashiach, and Yidden are going to be chachamim g'dolim, very, very wise, and the world is going to be filled with the knowledge of the Eibishter, tir ba'hadeya va'chachma va'emes, as the Rambam tells us, there will be all the wisdom and the truth, etc. So obviously we're going to be learning and understanding Torah shaloi be'erech, infinitely more than the way we know it and understand it now. To use the expression of the Chazal in Medrash that say that the Torah that's learned now is like hevel, it's just like ear, compared to the Torah that we're going to be learning la'asid lavi by Mashiach. And therefore we could say that the whole learning of Torah bisman hazeh, even from an adult, is no more than, again, comparing it to the way of La'asad Lavoi, it's like the learning of a child. All of our learning Torah today is like a child. Another point that Rebbe says, just like it is in regards to the inyan of limud HaTorah of a child, that it's mainly a matter of chinuch, we're preparing him to the main obligation for when he's going to be an adult. So too, we could say, says the Rebbe, the whole idea of the way we learn Torah these days, the learning now is like a preparation. It's a chinuch for the learning Torah the way it's going to be La'asad Lavoi. Only after we have the idea of v'talmudoi biyodoi, as the Gemara says. In other words, when a person learns Torah in this world, he comes along with this Torah from this world, then he's able to accept the Torah b'shleimus in the most perfect way from Mashiach. So in other words, what the Rebbe is saying is perhaps we could say that the reason we're so focused on learning Torah of children is because our Torah now is like that child in these two ways that we just mentioned. Again, one, that it's only like a child compared to an adult, and secondly, it's like a preparation for the time of Mashiach. But the Rebbe is not happy. The Rebbe says this explanation is not completely satisfying. Why? Because the same thing is true in a similar way regarding all mitzvahs. It says about mitzvahs that the mitzvahs that we do these days are tziyunim, they're just like a little sign, a marker, a little indication of the mitzvahs, the way we're going to be fulfilling them, La'asad Lavi, because only then are we going to be able to be fulfilling the mitzvahs properly, k'mitzvahs ritzaynecha, in the most perfect way. In other words, that mitzvahs these days are also like only small compared to the mitzvahs of La'asad Lavoi. And therefore, it's only again like education or a preparation for the mitzvahs, the way they're going to be fulfilled in the most fullest way, La'asad Lavoi. So therefore, these ideas that we said about Torah being like a child, these days that applies to mitzvahs as well. But from the fact that it's only regarding mitzvahs Talmud Torah, that we say as a special shaychus to a child, and furthermore, as we said, the whole way of learning out the mitzvah of Talmud Torah is included in the words Voeschanan levonecha. This tells us that there's something unique and special by Talmud Torah that has this idea of the idea of a katan and teaching to a child, etc., specifically connected to Talmud Torah more than anything else. So we need to understand why that is. In order to explain this, says the Rebbe, we're going to first have a look at the difference between Torah and mitzvahs. So mitzvahs we know we do with physical objects, and the main idea is to accomplish, to affect, to change these objects that in the world itself we are bringing down, and we are making this into a holy place, and the object into a holy object. The Rebbe says this is similar to the famous expression and the idea that we speak about a gavra. There's the person, but he's achieving something in the chefza, in the object. That's what mitzvahs are all about. We're trying to elevate, to refine the gashmias. We're trying to transform the koiches of our nefesh habahamis and so on, with which we are doing the mitzvah. And therefore, even though, of course, mitzvahs also need to be done with bittul, we are doing them not because our seichel tells us to do it, but rather because this is the will of Hashem. As we say in the brachas before a mitzvah, asher kedeshanu b'mitzvoisav, v'tzivanu, that it's all about the Eibishter commanding us to do the mitzvahs. Nevertheless, the main idea in the mitzvah is that the mitzvah is fulfilled, the action of the mitzvah. In other words, the bittul that we have, that we should have when we do the mitzvah, or as the Chazal say that the mitzvah is mitzaref es habriyos, it refines us and all of that. The idea is that the mitzvah needs to also transform and change something in the person. That is not the most crucial part in the mitzvah itself. That's not ma'akiv. You're still going to do the mitzvah even if you didn't have that bittul, even if you weren't a changed person. That does not affect, it does not impact the actual mitzvah itself, was achieved, was done, if the mitzvah was done with a physical object. However, when it comes to Limud HaTorah, the whole idea of Limud HaTorah is that the person needs to understand it with his seichel. In other words, his seichel needs to become united with the idea, with the concept, with the intellectual idea that he's learning about. And the way of learning has to always be that he's not learning it. In other words, he's not going to understand it the way he feels like the matter should be. Only what he wants, that's the way the conclusion is going to be. He's trying to look and search for the truth of what the emes is. He's trying to look at it in an objective way, and he has to put his own desires aside. So in other words, over here we're seeing the idea of bittul is much more important. And by Torah, of course, it's putting his own seichel aside to try to understand the chachma of Hashem. And therefore, the bittul over here becomes a crucial inyan in the idea of limud HaTorah. Because since the Chachma of Hashem is completely beyond the boundaries of Nivroim, of created beings, so it's impossible that the Seichel of Hashem, that the Chachma of Hashem should be able to be absorbed by a human being unless he's learning it with bittul. If he's learning it only with his Seichel, it's very easy to suddenly go off the right track and to be, as the Mishnah says, Megal Panim B'Torah Shaloi Kahalacha, that the person could chas v'shalom be learning Pshat in the Torah completely wrong. In other words, yes, you may be having chachma, some sort of intellect, and saying very good ideas and svaras, but it's not going to be the halacha of Torah. You're not going to be in accordance with Hashem's chachma. It is for this reason that Chazal tell us that there must be the idea of making a bracha before we learn Torah. As a preparation, as a foundation for learning Torah, there absolutely must be the idea that we're recognizing that it's Hashem's Torah. We make the bracha where we emphasize v'nasan lanu es Torah, so that this is Hashem's Torah, it's Hashem's chachma. And that brings out the person's bittul to the giver of the Torah, to Hashem. And only in that way are you going to be a keli that is deserving, that is fitting, that is able to absorb Hashem's Torah. So again, just to summarize this last sif, what the Rebbe so far said over here is that there's a huge difference in mitzvahs and in Torah. Although, of course, in mitzvahs one needs to have bittul, but the person technically could have done the mitzvah and he fulfilled the mitzvah even without bittul. When it comes to limud HaTorah, the bittul becomes such a crucial introduction to the limud HaTorah, because otherwise he could be completely going off track if it's only going to be about the way I want to see things, rather than what's the emes, and especially the emes of Torah. Another point, says the Rebbe now, just like we need to have this idea of bittul as an introduction before learning Torah, and only then can you become a keli for the Torah of Hashem, so too, it's extremely important to have bittul. The person learning Torah needs to have that bittul also while he's learning, and again, more than in mitzvahs. By mitzvah, says the Rebbe, when a person does the mitzvah properly, because that's what the Eibishter said. So when he's doing this mitzvah, his own mitzvah, his own existence is sort of out of the picture completely. In other words, what's his mode right now? I am doing what Hashem wants. That's all there is to it. And therefore, it's not so important and necessary to keep on making sure that the avodah needs to be done with bittul, because that's the whole point. That's what a mitzvah is about. Of course, I am acting now, doing a mitzvah. This is what Hashem asked me to do. This is what I'm doing. When it comes to Torah, however, since in Torah there's this idea that the seichel of the person's own intellect, is uniting with the idea that he's learning, in this case, the chachma of Hashem, that means that when he's going to learn Torah properly, according to the emes, it's going to be in a way that with his svara, with his logic, he worked hard with his seichel, and now it became one with the chachma of Hashem. We need to make sure that it shouldn't get mixed into all of this at all, any sort of ulterior motives, any sort of bribery of self, of one's own seichel, of one's own mitzias. In other words, the person that's learning Torah could sometimes make a mistake and think that I'm already on such a high level that to me only matters the emes of Torah, and I am the one that's really getting what the Eibishter wants, basically. And if someone else is going to come and say differently to the way I understood it, I'm automatically going to think that obviously what he is saying is the opposite of Torah, because I'm so convinced, I'm so sure that I was mechaven to the emes of Torah. The Rebbe gives an example over here in the square brackets. The Rebbe gives an example from a Gemara, where the Gemara speaks over there and says about seeing a Talmid Chacham getting angry. And you should realize it's the Torah that's heating him up, so to speak. I think what the Rebbe is trying to say is sometimes a person convinces himself that about himself. He's so convinced that he's right that anything that he feels, he's automatically associating with, it must be because of my Torah. Whereas in truth, it's very possible that what's really bothering me is the fact that the other person is saying opposite of my understanding, of my seichel. It's not really that's the seichel of Torah. In other words, if my yeshus is involved over here, this could be a very dangerous situation where I'm convinced that everybody else is saying the opposite of Torah and only I'm right because I'm the one that got it right. And therefore, when one learns Torah, it must be permeated with bittul to make sure that there's no self, there's no yeshus that's mixing in and bribing the person and changing the person, making the person making the person's seichel to understand the Eibishter's Chachma in the wrong way, chas v'shalom. Says the Rebbe in Sif Hey, this is the idea of these two things that we spoke about before. That limud HaTorah, number one, exists by a cotton as well. Min HaTorah, we teach Torah to a child. And number two, even the learning of the adult is included in Voeschanan Leverecha. We learn it out from the idea of learning with a child. Because it's in these two ideas that express the two ideas of bittul that we just spoke about in mitzvah of Talmud Torah. The Rebbe says, the fact that learning Torah starts off as when we are a child. And similar to this, and I'll call panim midrabanan, even from such a small age when we hardly even have any understanding at all, but rather just when we start speaking. This emphasizes the first point, that the yisoid, the basis, the foundation for limud HaTorah is not about the seichel, but it's about the bittul of the person. He has to put himself aside, he has to be himself mevatel, nullify himself to the giver of the Torah, which is higher than any sort of logic and seichel. This idea of bittul has nothing to do with how great and how smart the person is. On the contrary, this is the idea, this is something that exists even by a little tiny child because of his neshama. So this is point number one. We start learning Torah with a child, because here we're focusing, number one, on the bittul that's needed before you start learning. Then comes point number two, and that is that even the learning of an adult is included in the mitzvah v'shinantam levanecha of teaching to a child, meaning that's teaching us that while we are learning, first we were speaking about the foundation before we learn, but also that while we are learning, when we're already involved in our seichel, as the style of learning of a gadol, with our understanding, but always keeping in mind that it's with a bittul like that child that I'm learning, because I'm also still very small and hopefully very humble. So up until here, the Rebbe was explaining the actual idea that we started speaking about in the beginning of the Sicha, these two elements of the idea of learning Torah with a child and like a child, etc. And from here, the Rebbe is going to connect it to Pirkei Avos as well. Says the Rebbe in Se'ivav, we spoke many times that since every single inyan, especially in Torah's ba'ashgacha protis and accurate, etc., it's understood that there's always going to be a connection between the Parshas HaShavua and the Peirik and Pirkei Avos that's being learned and said on the specific Shabbos, of those Shabbosim between Pesach and Shavuos, and similarly in the summer Shabbosim generally, according to the minig, to say Pirkei Avos during the summer months. In this particular case, says the Rebbe, so the Rebbe is speaking over here in a Kvius where you had Shabbos Tisha B'Av. The Rebbe says, since there are opinions in Poskim, there's discussion in Poskim whether you say Pirkei Avos also on Shabbos Tisha B'Av or not, and Eilu v'Eilu Divrei Elikim Chaim. So we're going to be discussing over here in the Sicha according to the opinion that you do say Pirkei Avos on this sort of Shabbos. Especially, says the Rebbe, since Achakaloi, we await Mashiach's coming with a tremendous yearning and desire every single day that Mashiach is coming immediately. And these days will be transformed into Yomim Tovim. Especially when we're standing so close right now to Shabbos Tisha B'Av, then of course we're standing with the greatest shukah, with the greatest yearning for Mashiach, and L'chol HaDeyos, with then, once this day is transformed into a happy day, then of course we'll say Pirkei Avos. So the Rebbe says like this, in addition to the general connection between Parshas Voeschanan and the Peirik, that week being the fourth Peirik that you would say on that year in Shabbos Parshas Voeschanan, that in both of them you find many inyanim related to Talmud Torah. A number of commands for Talmud Torah is in Parshas Voeschanan. A number of Mishnayos in the Peirik contain Hirois in regards to Limud Torah. We also find two Mishnahs in the Peirik, a very specific Hayrah and emphasis regarding these two ideas of bittul that we spoke about that are needed in regards to Talmud Torah. So the Rebbe says, first of all, a Mishnah Chof. We have a Mishnah like this. Haloi Torah Yeled, when a person learns Torah as a child. L'mao doima, what's he compared to? L'dioi, to ink that was written on a clean piece of paper. Whereas a person that learns Torah when he's old, what's he compared to? To ink written on paper that had already things erased from it. The Rebbe says, seemingly it's not understood. We understand the important Torah from the first half of the Mishnah about learning Torah when you're a child. This is encouraging a Yid, how important it is to learn child in his youth and not to delay to when he gets older. But what's the Mishnah coming along and telling us and warning us about a person learning Torah when he's old? Is the Mishnah trying to tell us that if a person didn't manage, for whatever reason it is, to learn Torah when he's young, and now he's old, should he give up chas v'shalom of ever being successful in learning Torah? Says the Rebbe, the explanation is, based on what we said before, we're not only speaking about physically in age, young and old. The message over here is, Aloy mit Torah yaled, that a person learns Torah with bittul, he's making himself small like a child. In that way, you will have the Torah really become absorbed by you, like ink on a fresh piece of paper. But if the learning Torah is only with your chachma and seichel, in other words, you're like an older person with seichel, etc., zokin shakana chachma without the bittul, then the Torah, the real Torah, the Torah of Hashem, cannot be absorbed inside of you. So in other words, it's not coming to give up a person, chas v'shalom, make a person give up hope. On the contrary, we're telling a person, even if you're older, the way you should be learning Torah is like a child. Then comes Mishnah Yutes. Says the Rebbe, the Mishnah says as follows. Shmuel HaKatan says, B'nefoilo yivcha al tismach, when your enemy falls, do not rejoice. Ubi koshli, when he stumbles, al yoga libecha, your heart shouldn't be gladdened. Pen yira Hashem, in case Hashem will see this, v'ra be'einav, this will be bad in his eyes, v'heishiv me'olav apoy, and take the anger off that other person. And as we'll see, as the Mefarshim explain, as the Rebbe says over here also, it means chas v'shalom, the Eibishter's anger will go on to this person that's rejoicing. So, a very, very famous question, says the Rebbe, what is Shmuel HaKatan actually telling us? What's the novel idea that he's telling us? This whole Mishnah, everything that Shmuel HaKatan Oimer, everything that he says, B'nefoy lo yivcha, that whole verse is actually a clear pasuk in Mishlei. So the Machzer Vitri explains that the pasuk is speaking about when it's the people are in a fight over worldly matters. That's what the pasuk was referring to. Shmuel HaKatan is coming to tell us, and his chidush is that this is true also when there's a fight between people in a matter of Torah. That means two Talmidei Chachamim that are fighting, that are arguing with themselves, with each other in Torah. And one of them is victorious over the other. So the person who is victorious has to know, B'nefoy lo yivcha, when your enemy falls, don't rejoice. Don't rejoice because you were victorious. Says the Rebbe, this is similar to a famous tefillah that the Gemara says that Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana would daven before he went into Beis Medrash, start learning V'lo yikoshlu chaveirai b'dvar halacha, that my friends shouldn't stumble in a matter of halacha, which should chas v'shalom cause that I should rejoice against their failure. Now, why is it, says the Rebbe, that there should be any difference that in the war of Torah we may think that it would be okay to rejoice in for your enemy's downfall, and that's why Shmuel HaKatan has to come and say even in Melchamta Shel Torah you shouldn't rejoice. So the Rebbe explains, because the attitude over here could be that if a person was victorious over another person in a matter of halacha, he may feel it's not my victory, this is a victory for Torah. It was clarified, a matter of Torah became clarified. So that's what I'm becoming very joyful over. It's not about myself, it's about the Torah being victorious. It says, Shmuel HaKatan b'nefoy yivcha al tismach. If in truth the emes of Torah would matter to you, then you would never feel in that simcha that your enemy fell down, that you were victorious over him. All you would feel is a positive opinion. Baruch Hashem, a matter in Torah was clarified. That's point number one. Point number two, says the Rebbe, if in truth you would really be interested with an emes, focused on just revealing Hashem's chachma, you wouldn't even necessarily think that the other person is your enemy in the sense that he's wrong, because we know there's a concept, Elu ve'elu divrei elikim chaim. So yes, it's true that for practical halacha, you can never have according to both opinions. Because practically, you can only act according to one opinion. But both opinions are true. Both opinions are true in divrei elikim chaim. Therefore, says the Rebbe, even after the psak halacha, that you may have been right in the psak halacha, but the other opinion is still a matter of Torah. And therefore, you can never say about it that your enemy has fallen down. And since, says the Rebbe, you are feeling a joy and that your enemy has fallen down, that itself is a sign that there's a certain feeling over here of didan notzach. Oh, I won. I was victorious over the other person. In other words, there's very much a feeling of self over here. And that's why Shmuel HaKatan comes along and tells us. And the Rebbe says, Shmuel HaKatan, why was he called Shmuel HaKatan? Because he was very humble, held himself very, very small. He teaches us that limud ha-Torah must be with bitul. So that b'nefoy lo yivcha al tismach, you should never rejoice about another person's downfall in Yom of Torah. All that should matter to you is just to try to find the emes of Torah itself. Says the Rebbe, but a person could come along and argue, yes, it's true that the other person's opinion might be true according to Torah as far as Eilu ve'Eilu Divrei Elokim Chaim is concerned. And it's also part of Torah. But the person could argue and say, but that the other guy was trying to have his opinion be used in halacha l'maisa, in practical halacha. And that's definitely a mistake. Because clearly, that's not the halacha. And therefore, maybe that guy is the enemy. And the enemy fell down. In other words, Baruch Hashem, that the other opinion wasn't accepted because it was against halacha. So why should we demand by this person that al tismach, he shouldn't rejoice, and he shouldn't even feel that his enemy had fallen down? The bottom line is he made sure that an untruth shouldn't be accepted in halacha, and that should bring out a tremendous simcha by him. Says Shmuel Hanavi, and he brings the pasuk. Continuation of the pasuk. Pen yira Hashem, in case Hashem will see. V'ra be'einav v'heishiv me'olav apoi. What does this mean? Says the Rebbe. It's possible that the reason the other person did not manage to get the halacha right wasn't because there was something wrong, a deficiency in that person's understanding and his seichel. But rather it could be that Hashem was upset with him for whatever reason. There was apoi, the heishiv me'olav apoi. That means there was an anger that Hashem had with that person, and therefore he wasn't zoicha that the halacha should be like him. And therefore, never rejoice bin foila yivcha from the fact that person ended up being punished, and that through you punishment came from Hashem on the other person. The only simcha you could have is that a matter of halacha came out with its emes, but never rejoicing that another person had a downfall. And Adarabah, says the Rebbe, if this person is going to be happy when his enemy falls, it might happen, says the Rebbe. Now with this you're going to cause, as the pasuk says, Pen yira Hashem v'rabeina v'heishiv me'olav apoi, that the Eibishter is chas v'sholem kavayachol, so to speak, going to take the anger of the other person, and it will end up on this person that's actually rejoicing. Says the Rebbe, by thinking about all of this will be poil, that not only don't you rejoice bin foila yivcha when your enemy falls, but on the contrary, it will be fulfilled the exact opposite. That as the Gemara says, Einam Zazim Usham, and two Talmidei Chachamim are fighting with each other, but in the proper way, then they don't move away from there until they become best friends with each other. And furthermore, as the Chazal say, in regards to Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, that Chiba v'reyus noyagim zebazah, they act in extra friendly ways with each other, as the pasuk says, Ha'emes v'asholem ahavu, that you should be loving emes and peace.